The Baha'i faith has its origins in 19th century Iran. It is thus also important to know that the religion develops out of Shia Islam, which was the prominent religion in the region at the time. The Shiites believe that the descendants in the Prophet Muhammad's family, who are called Imams, are the rightful leaders of the Muslim community, and the Twelver branch of Shiism, which is the largest today, believe that there were 12 Imams, starting with the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law Ali, and ending with a figure whose name is Muhammad al-Mahdi, who lived in the 9th century. Whereas all the other Imams, the first 11 Imams, died, the last Imam, the 12th, al-Mahdi, is thought to have gone into occultation, or spiritual hiding, you could say, and is thought to return at the end of time to redeem the world at the beginning of Judgment Day. Al-Mahdi is thus a kind of messianic figure in Shia Islam who is thought to return at the end of time to reinstate true religion in the world. In the writings of the Ikhwan as-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, who were likely Ismailis, the second largest group of Shiites, there is an abundance of this kind of rhetoric. They viewed history as cyclical and divided world history into cycles of 7,000 years, which is, by the way, the true meaning to them of God creating the world in 7 days. And each 1,000 years within the 7,000-year period is a cycle that is associated with a certain prophet. So the first 1,000 years is the cycle of Adam, followed by the cycle of Noah, Abraham, and so on, until we reach the 6th cycle, which is that of Muhammad, and which, according to them, is the current cycle or era. The 7th cycle will begin at the coming of al-Mahdi, or al-Qa'im, which is two names for the same person, the messianic figure who will redeem the world at the end of time and reinstate true religion. They also believed in this al-Mahdi figure, but thought that it was a different Imam who was this figure. So this idea of al-Mahdi or al-Qa'im as this messianic figure who will return is present in many branches of Shiism, with the only difference being that different branches believe that different Imams were this Mahdi figure. These are kinds of ideas that were prevalent in all of Shiism and in Twelver Shiism as well. And this would thus have a large influence and impact on the events that took place in Iran in the 19th century. The beginnings of this story can arguably be said to be in a movement called Sheikhism, which originates in the early 19th century with a guy called Sheikh Ahmad al-Ashai. He and his successor Said Kazim Rashdi presented a unique interpretation of Shia doctrine. The Sheikhis seem to have emphasized a kind of mysticism, and that Sheikh Ahmad had visionary experiences of the Imams. But one of the central ideas that they seem to have occupied themselves with the most was the return of the Mahdi. Indeed, a very important and significant date was approaching. In the Islamic calendar, the 12th Imam is said to have disappeared in the year 260 after Hijrah, which is the year 874 in the regular Gregorian calendar. Very soon, in the mid-1800s, would be the Islamic year 1260 after Hijrah. This means exactly 1,000 years after the disappearance of the last Imam. So given the preoccupation some Shias had with cyclical time, and in particular with 1,000-year cycles, as we talked about, this resulted in an atmosphere of great expectation in the community. Was al-Mahdi to return soon? The Sheikhis represent one group who very much believed so. They very much held the idea that the Mahdi was to return very, very soon, and told their followers to be on the lookout for him. When the second leader of the Shaykhis, Said Kazim Rishti, died in 1843, there was a crisis of succession. He hadn't actually appointed anyone's successor as leader of the community, but instead insisted that al-Mahdi had actually returned and told his followers instead to go look for al-Mahdi and have him as their new leader instead. This brings us to a very interesting young man by the name of Zaid Ali Muhammad al-Shirazi. As his name suggests, he was from the city Shiraz in modern Persia and had been born in 1819. By the time Zaid Kazim Rashdi died in 1843, Said Ali Muhammad was only about 24 years old, but he had already garnered a reputation as a kind of holy man or mystic in his hometown. On the night of May 22nd, 1844, a prominent Shaykhi by the name Mullah Hussein traveled to the city of Shiraz to look for the Mahdi or Qa'im as his leader had instructed him.
In the mid-19th century, there was a worldwide sense of messianic expectation. And in Iran, there was a young man named Mullah Hussein who not only felt this expectation, but was convinced that the promised one that he was searching for was already in the world and that it was his mission to search for him and find him.
A spring evening in 1844. Mullah Hussein, a young scholar and seeker after truth, is searching for the promised one. After many weeks of prayer and fasting, Mullah Hussein feels drawn, as if by a magnet, to the city of Shiraz, renowned for the sweet perfume of its roses and the melodies of its nightingales.
Once there, he was invited to the house of Sayyid Ali Muhammad, and what happened that night in that house would be one of the most significant religious events and turning points in the last few centuries.
At dusk, as he arrives wearily at the city gate, a radiant young man approaches Mullah Hussein and greets him as if he were a lifelong friend. Overwhelmed by this welcome, Mullah Hussein accepts an invitation to visit the stranger's home.
Sayyid Ali Muhammad declared that night to Mullah Hussein, exactly 1,000 years after the disappearance of the last 12 Imam, that he was Al-Bab, the gate to the 12th Imam. Mullah Hussein is said to have then asked the Bab, which is the name that he would then go by and which I will refer to him by from now on, a couple of questions to prove his identity, which he apparently answered in a satisfactory manner by writing a book, or the first section of a book called Qayyum al-Asma, which has become one of the most important sacred scripture for both Babis, followers of the Bab, and later Baha'is as well. In this text, he refers to himself as, quote, the greatest remembrance of God and as the gate to the hidden Imam.
During that momentous evening, a conversation takes place that will change Mullah Hussein's life and the entire course of human history. As their conversation continues into the early hours of morning, Mullah Hussein is astonished to discover that every answer he receives to his questions establishes beyond a shadow of a doubt his host's claim that he is the Bab, the promised one.
He was actually the Imam himself. He was Al-Mahdi, who had returned to fulfill the prophecy and was thus a new messenger of God. Mullah Hussein at that point became a devoted follower of the Bab, and soon many other shaykhis followed in his footsteps as well, and thus there had developed a movement around the Bab which became known as Babism. You can imagine the whisperings and atmosphere that must have prevailed in the region at the time. The Imam is said to have returned, Al-Mahdi is said to have returned, and there are these secret sacred writings that are being spread around. What if it's actually true? This was obviously a very radical idea that, if true, would mean a turning point in history, and of course also would mean that the day of judgment was approaching. He was put on trial that same year, since his movement had become an increasing threat to the leaders and the clergy, and during this very famous trial, when asked to reveal or explain his identity and his mission, he is famously reported to have said, quote, "I am the Qa'im that you have been waiting for," thus confirming his intentions to a shocked audience. This was a radical break with established mainstream Shia Islam, and one that would, of course, establish Babism as an entirely new movement or religion in a way. In the words of Peter Smith, quote, "In Shiite terms, the Bab's public claim to be the Mahdi was a profoundly radical act. In popular belief, the Mahdi was the rightful ruler of the faithful and the inaugurator of the final days prior to the resurrection. To the Babis, this also meant a break with Sharia, or Islamic law, which was to be replaced by a new Babi law, one that was contained in one of the Bab's books called the Bayan, which in a way was supposed to replace the Quran as the most sacred law-giving scripture. The life and movement of the Bab is, of course, to a large degree supported by his great charisma, but also by his teachings and ideas. He is said to have composed an almost inhuman amount of different texts and writings, everything from letters to divinely inspired revelations. Many of his followers and those who met him often report that he was able to just improvise divinely inspired verses in a very rapid speed. For example, his first follower, Mullah Hussein, tells the story of that very fateful night when the Bab revealed his identity. Quote, "He took up his pen and with incredible rapidity revealed the entire Suri of Mulk, the first chapter of his commentary on the Suri of Joseph. The overpowering effect of the manner in which he wrote was heightened by the gentle intonation of his voice which accompanied his writing. Not for one moment did he interrupt the flow of the verses which streamed from his pen. Not once did he pause until the Suri of Mulk was finished. I sat enraptured by the magic of his voice and the sweeping force of his revelation." The book or scripture he's referring to is called Qayyum al-Asma, which is considered to be his earliest work, and he also composed many other different kinds of texts, letters, scriptures, and books. The largest and most significant is often considered the so-called Persian Bayan, which he wrote while imprisoned in Maku. In these scriptures, he discusses everything from the Babi law that was to replace the Sharia to his very unique and esoteric interpretations of Quranic concepts and verses. It is clear that he views time as cyclical and also very uniquely holds that same idea of prophetic cycles, each cycle being associated with a certain prophet. Now, this idea we of course recognize from the Ismailis that we discussed earlier. He refers to these prophets, the same prophets basically that Islam has, like Adam and Noah, Abraham, Jesus, Muhammad. He refers to them by the name manifestation of God, which should not be understood as incarnation, but rather a person in whom God's attributes are reflected perfectly, and so he's a prophet basically, but the name he uses and the later Baha'is would use is manifestation.
Unknown to a sleeping world, the promised day of God has dawned. O peoples of the earth, verily the resplendent light of God hath appeared in your midst, invested with this unerring book, that ye may be guided aright to the ways of peace, and by the leave of God step out of the darkness into the light, and onto this far extended path of truth.